If you want to open your Bibles to Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah chapter 2, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 5. Nehemiah 2:1 starts out, "And it came about in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him. And I took up the wine and I gave it to the king. I had never been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but the sadness of the heart.' Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, 'Let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed with fire?' Then the king said to me, 'What would you request?' So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, 'If it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it.'" God, this morning, I'm thankful for a warm place, a dry place, for us to gather and sing songs of praise, but also encourage one another. About how he carried himself in the presence of a king and when obstacles were laid before him. I pray, God, that they would take root in our lives and in mine personally, just to be able to see the fortitude that he had and admire, but and I love you, Jesus. Amen. So we are in our mini series of our big series, the big series being the Bible, going through the Bible one book at a time, 1 week per book, which doesn't do any book justice. And Nehemiah is one of those books that it's really, really, really not going to do justice. And real quick, a weird story about Nehemiah. I have these Israeli friends, and I was asking them, how do you say, I'm only going to say this one time because it hurt. I mean, you hear everybody coughing, and I've been coughing all week, so this really hurts my throat to do, but I'm going to show you here in just a second. Nehemiah in Hebrew. And he goes, "What?" And I was like, "Nehemiah, how do you say Nehemiah in Hebrew?" And he's like, I don't understand what you're saying. And I said, "I'm saying Nehemiah, from like the Torah, the book, Nehemiah." And he's like, "I have no idea what you're even talking about." And I said, "Okay, there was this King Artaxerxes, and the Hebrew people, they were enslaved, and then they were coming back, and they wanted to build it all, and then Ezra showed up, and he was like a priest, and then this one guy who was working for Artaxerxes shows back up, and then he starts building the walls. You remember that guy? He did it like in 52 days or something? And he goes, 'Are you talking about Nehemiah?' And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I guess I am talking about Nehemiah." But for our sake, we're going to just refer to it as Nehemiah, our sake and my throat's sake, the rest of the morning. But Nehemiah's story is an amazing story. And in this series that we're in, the mini-series right now of anarchy and life without a king and how none of us want to bend our lives to anything else, Nehemiah's story stands out in such an amazing way because he's a guy who did. One man. Like we left Judges with there was no king in Israel and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And all of a sudden we get this story of Nehemiah who doesn't do whatever's right in his own eyes, does follow a king, and things change dramatically. Israel had had their city torn down and destroyed. It laid in ruins. They had torn down, they said there wasn't a brick standing upon brick. And we looked at all the different things, and when we get to Lamentations, we'll go over how horrific the city had become. Where it said people who were once fat and ruddy, which I don't really know what that means, are now sickly and ashen, and their skin is dripping from their bones. Israel was in a terrible spot. Esther, which we're going to talk about next week, she's Artaxerxes' wife. She was placed there for this one moment in time to try to save God's people and this kingdom. Nehemiah goes before the king and he says, "I just heard this news. My friends got back and they went and saw Jerusalem and they told me the stories there, and it broke my heart. In the first chapter of Nehemiah, he spends verse after verse after verse just praying and confessing to God, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the wickedness that we've done. All of my family and myself, my people. Like we've broken your laws and your commandments. We've not taken them seriously and we've fallen to this place. But God, I'm asking and I'm praying and I'm begging you that you give me one opportunity to make things right. They'd worked on the walls of this temple and done different things for 40, 50 years. Nothing could ever happen. And every time they started and tried to get going, something would happen. We read about Ezra last week, which is actually a later story. But we talked about Ezra last week, how these people came to help and he would push them away and he would set up all these laws and all these rules to exempt people from helping and all this kind of stuff. And so at every turn, this was a frustrated, fractioned, broken up mess of people. One group of people hated another group of people. This group of people over here hated. They only loved people because they hated the same things. They didn't love people for loving the same things. They loved people for hating the same things. And they were this just terribly fractioned community of people. I don't know if that sounds familiar to anyone else, but it sounds familiar to me, not just in our country, but pretty much any time we're in a community of people, maybe even in families. They couldn't get going on anything. They couldn't do anything right. They couldn't even set one stone on top of another. Everything they tried to do at every turn, it was frustrated by something. Whether it was their enemies writing letters frustrating them, whether it was their enemies standing in their way, whether it was people attacking them, whether it was they themselves attacking one another, whether it was stealing, robbing, whatever it was, they couldn't get anything done. And then this guy, Nehemiah, shows up. And in 52 days, builds the walls of the city. Something that had been years and years and years in planning and hoping and trying and efforting, and it didn't happen, but in 52 days, he built them. 52 days. So how did it happen? And that's the story we're going to look at this morning. The very first thing we read, and it came about in the month of Nisan. Now, Nisan is April, more or less. That's when he goes before the king, in April. But in December, because the book starts out, now it came about in the month of Chislev, which is December, he hears this story, and he hears all these stories of the people. But it's not until April that he ever brings it up, which is very much, I guess, different than how I am in things. If I hear of a problem, or if I hear a good story, or if I hear something new, I pretty much want to share it immediately afterwards. I mean, you can see that in all of our lives if you look at any kind of social media. Like we're share. I mean, the share button's right there. We just boom, 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 boom. We constantly operate in a staccato lifestyle when God has called us many times to live in a legato lifestyle, and we're just doing things. When we're faced with a challenge in our own life, or our corporate life, when we're faced with a struggle, when we've got to build something, and all of us have these feelings in different areas of our life. When we've got to repair something, one of the first lessons we can take from Nehemiah is he waited. He waited on God's timing. And it came about in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and I gave it to the king. He waited. He waited until the time was right. He didn't just jump in and start doing it. He didn't jump ahead. And if you read through the scriptures, it is constantly that same theme. God saying, wait on me. When they got out of captivity in Egypt and they wanted to cross the river, he said, wait until you see my ark go before you and stand behind it 300 paces. Don't jump in front of it, but that's what we constantly love to do. We see this opportunity and we want to take it. I've been driving a little bit in the streets of New York lately, and if there's this much space, somebody's going to try to squeeze inside that little space. And then what happens? Could be a crash, could be an accident, but more than likely, it's just this massive pileup that takes you an hour to go 0.3 of a mile. Because nobody waits. Why are our bank accounts overdrawn? Because we don't wait. Why are we in a place in our life and own a house that we should never own or any of those kinds of things? Because we don't wait. Why do we cause frustration with our kids or with our coworkers? Because we don't wait. Because our life is focused on ourselves. And so we're just, I need this, I need this, I need it now. Let's do it now. But Nehemiah heard all of these problems and all of these things going on, and it broke his heart, and he wept. It said that he wailed, which it's been a long time, if ever, that I've ever wailed over something. It was probably the most embarrassing time of my life when I wailed, and that was when I was a baby. That's the only time. But he's wailing over this, and he doesn't go right to the king and say, hey, we need to do something about this. But he waits, and he waits because he wants to do it in God's timing. Continue on in verse 1. Now I had not been sad in the presence of the king before. So the king said to me, why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart. And then I was very much afraid. You know why? Because being sad before a king was punishable by death. It meant that you were dissatisfied in his leadership. So here's Nehemiah. He shows up. He's been waiting for his opportunity. He shows up, and the king's like, why are you sad? Nehemiah said, I'd never been sad in his presence before because there's no way I was going to die for being sad. The king's like, why are you sad? And you're not sick. This is sickness of the heart. Now Nehemiah is terrified. So when God is leading us into this path to fix this struggle or repair this broken relationship or work through these problems or whatever it is, the first thing we need to do is wait. Wait on his timing. The second thing to do is now muster courage, because that is exactly what Nehemiah did. He said, I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when my city is destroyed? He mustered up the courage to lay out exactly what needed to be said. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't passively aggressively address it. He didn't say, oh, I'm not really sad. It's just, I might not be feeling good today. He didn't try to do any of that kind of stuff. He finally waited on God's timing and then stood and gave forth with courage, this is why I'm sad. You're asking me why I'm sad? Why shouldn't I be sad? My city is destroyed. Everything I've hoped in my entire heritage, my religion, everything is broken and crushed. You're asking me why I'm sad? We have to be courageous in our leadership. We have to be courageous in our relationships. We can't just let things happen. We can't just sit back and watch things go this way and then just try to appease everybody, because the most dangerous person in the world, the most dangerous person in this room, is the one who wants to make everyone happy. You have to be courageous. And when God is leading and when He's presenting you with an opportunity, you have to stand up and be courageous in that moment. Nehemiah was. So then the king said to me, what would you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Isn't that a cool line? What do you want? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Here's the king offering him, saying, just have whatever you want. What do you want? I'll give it to you. And so he doesn't just jump up like Solomon. He's like, I want wisdom, I want this, I want that, I want that. He says, so I prayed to the God of heaven, because Nehemiah knew this. Yes, this king had the power of the land to give him whatever he wants, but he had no power outside of the hand of God. And many times we forget that. We look around at authority figures and all these different things, and we feel like they have the power and they have the abilities and they have all of this kind of stuff. But in reality, they have nothing but what has been given to them by God. So I prayed to the Lord of heaven. I don't know about you. I just know about me. Most of the time, I skip that step. Somebody offers to help me. Somebody offers to do this. Somebody says, what is it you need? What do you want? And man, I am so quick with my answer because I've been waiting and holding this answer forever. This is what I need. This is what I want. It would be great if you could. It would be so helpful if you... I don't even take the time to stop and pray and ask God. Pray to the God of heaven. Verse 5, and I said to the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Here we see faith. So when we're being led into this repairing of relationships or courageous leadership or whatever it is that we're getting ready to do, building something, we wait, we have courage, we pray, and then this isn't a noun, it is an adjective, and then we faith. The word faith literally means to draw and bind. And I've said this over and over and over, but I always have to remind myself of this because I always think of faith as my action. It's just like my default setting is that thought. But the word faith comes from the men who would stand on the docks when the big ships would come in and they would toss them their ropes, and then faithful men would grab those ropes and they would draw the ship into the dock and they would tie it off and bind it. That is faith. That is what the word faith means. And it is God working in us, His faith drawing us in. So the only action we have in this faith is where we're casting our ropes. Are we casting it to the stock market? To a friend, to drugs, to hope, to a church building, to a person, to an idea, to a dream, to a political party? Where are we casting our ropes? Or are we casting our ropes to Christ? Because if we cast them to Him, He draws them in. And He binds us. And at this moment, this is what Nehemiah was doing. He had prayed to God, and God had given him a vision, and so he stood up and he said, listen, if I found favor before you, King, let me go. Like there was no reasonable reason for him to get to go. Like he was one of the king's most trusted men. I mean, he's the guy who hands the king his wine, which sounds like a simple job, but really he had to taste it every time beforehand just in case somebody put poison inside of it. He was probably the second or third most trusted member of Artaxerxes' kingdom. Very, very, very important to Artaxerxes. And he says, I want you to send me. I want to go and rebuild what God has chosen and called me to do. He's acting in faith because God has drawn and bound him to Himself. And so he has this courage now to say, this is what I need, this is what I want. And here's the king's response. Then the king said to me, with Esther sitting beside him, how long will your journey be? And when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. He won the king's favor. And this is the most, I think, wonderful part of this whole story. Have you been in those kinds of things? And yes, we all have them, and we have those times where it feels like we're just dragging something along, whatever it is. Whether there's this person that we're dragging along, whether it's this opportunity that we're dragging along, whether it's our job that we feel like we're lifting it up and carrying it and dragging it along. It's that whole picture of having to push the rock up the hill. What was that guy's name? Does anybody remember? Osiris? I don't know. Doesn't matter. He was cursed to have to push a giant rock uphill all the time. There's a lot of things in life that are that way. But every once in a while, you find that thing that pulls you. That's God's favor. Here he had found the king's favor. And if we read the rest of the story, we're going to find out that the king sends him with letters so that every province he goes to, he has this letter that says, the king said, you have to give me whatever I want. The king sends him with men. The king sends him with horses and camels and donkeys. He sends him with servants. He sends him with money. He sends him with tools. He lays out everything before him, and Nehemiah just walks through it, and then he arrives at a city because he had found favor. Favor is not something that we earn. Favor is something that is given just because. My kids didn't earn favor in my eyes. I mean, they're actually trying to unearn it all the time. They just have it. That's what we as Christians call grace. Unmerited, undeserved, unwarranted, unearned favor. It's the fact that God has called us to a place and called us to stand in a place that He has long beforehand prepared for us. And yes, the road might be hard at times, but you feel this gust of wind or this energy, or like Isaiah will say, we mount up with wings like eagles. We can soar, all of these different things, because we're moving towards and in God's plan. And there's favor there, even in the midst of the hard time, even in the midst of the difficulty, even in the midst of the struggle. Because when He shows up to that city, He doesn't just get to go, poof, and the city magically rebuilds itself. They have to go and clean up junk. They have to haul rocks from over here to over here. He's got guys that are trying to kill him. They work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He has people that are standing there, and at one time they say half of us were working on the wall, the other half were guarding. In other places it said I was working one hand with my shovel, the other hand with the shield, because all the enemies were trying to destroy what was being done. But Nehemiah had found favor, and in this difficulty, his heart never failed him. And he found joy after joy after joy along the way. But we have to wait. We have to have courage. Because everybody in the world, if you're doing something God's called you to, everybody in the world is going to try to discourage you from doing it. And they're going to point out all the reasons why not to. Even if it's trying to repair a broken relationship. You got to pray. You got to faith. Not have it. Live it. And then you find His favor. I've told this story before here, but I can't think of anything that better defines favor than this. But my brother-in-law, when we lived in Missouri, he had this friend named Edward, and Edward was one of the weirdest people I've ever met. He's so weird. I was trying to find like a nice way just in case he's watching this, but there's no way he's watching this, so it doesn't matter. He's weird. And he would wear this sailor hat all the time, and he called himself a sea captain, and it would drive me crazy because I was like, we're in Missouri, man. Like, this is actually the middle of the country. He had this little sailboat, and when I say little, I mean it was little. And he would go out in Lake of the Ozarks, and he'd take the sailboat out there. And I remember zooming by him sometimes, and my mother-in-law's, like, they'd be jet skiing and stuff, and we'd go zooming by him, and him and my brother-in-law Ryan and their other friend Matt would all just be laying there like this, getting sunburnt because there was no wind on the lake, and their sailboat's just sitting there rocking back and forth like that. It looked totally miserable. Well, he only had like two friends in the world, Ryan and Matt, and they both moved away. And Ryan moved down to South Texas, right on the ocean, like South Padre Island, Texas. And one Christmas, we were all together, and Edward was there, and not only did he always wear a sea captain hat, but he talked like Sean Connery. He said it was a speech impediment. I don't know how you get that speech impediment. I prayed for that speech impediment. It's never happened, but so he, and you would be like, what do you do for a living? And you'd be like, I'm a sea captain. And you'd be like, yeah, okay, buddy. So he's there, and they're talking about stuff, and he said, I'm going to go visit Ryan. And I was like, really? And he was like, yeah. And he's like, I'm taking my boat down there. And I said, isn't that going to be expensive? And he's like, no, sailing's free. And I was like, but we're in Missouri. And he's like, no, every river runs to the ocean. And I said, you can sail a boat on the river? And he's like, yeah, I can sail out on the river, of course. Like, how else am I going to get there? And I said, so you're going to leave Missouri, go down the Mississippi River, go into the Gulf of Mexico, and then go over to Corpus Christi, Texas? And he's like, yeah, of course. And I was like, man. And I said, like, how far is a knot? What is a knot? And he's like, I don't know. And I said, do you know how to tie, like, isn't it a sheep shank knot or something like that sailors use? Do you know how to tie one of those? And he's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I was like, which side's starboard? And he's like, I don't know. What's port? I don't know. I was asking him all these questions, and he didn't know any of them. And finally, I was like, I think you're going to die, Edward. And he said, listen, I might not know all that technical junk, but I can feel the wind blowing, and I know how to raise a sail. I remember it was like 6 months later, and I was talking with my brother-in-law, Ryan. I was like, hey, did Edward ever make it down to Corpus Christi? Is he alive? Is what I really wanted to ask. And he's like, yeah, he's there. And I said, you're kidding me. And he's like, no, he. And I said, is his boat there, or did he just fight? And he's like, no, he sailed down there. This story of Nehemiah is that story. He wasn't a construction worker. He wasn't an architect. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't a great man. He wasn't this manager. But he felt the wind of the Spirit moving. And he didn't know all the right tricks, and he didn't know how to tie this kind of knot, or where this side was, or where that side was. And we're in the same place. Like, we could have this jacked up, messed up, broken relationship with somebody. We could be called to be leading something. We could be called to just doing something, and we don't know how to do it, and we can make all the excuses in the world. Well, I don't know what this is, and I don't know what this is, and you know what does forgiveness really mean? And what does love really mean? And what does this really mean? And trying to define out all of these terms. But the favor of God is this, that when you feel him moving, all you have to do is raise your sail, and you too can ride rivers to the ocean. Because it's not about us. It's 100% in Christ alone. Let's sing.